Today on Living History, we're speaking with Melinda Liu.
The simple act of filing a story was a major deal. First I had to type it out. Then I had to get on my bicycle and ride down to something called the Telegraph Building. And either they would do it or sometimes I would do it. Type into a telex machine. So you have to retype the whole thing again, and it spits out a little tape with holes in it and whatnot. And then when it's all done, that's what gets transmitted. It took hours, and that's how we filed in those days.
Today, we're speaking with Melinda Liu, who became one of the first American correspondents in the PRC when she opened the Newsweek bureau in Beijing in 1980. The daughter of parents who emigrated from China after World War II, Melinda grew up in Ohio but still had an elder brother living in Suzhou, whom she met for the first time in 1979. She studied with the late great Ezra Vogel and wrote stories from the trials of the Gang of Fours and the Sichuan earthquake to the 2008 Beijing Olympics and COVID-19. Few have seen as much of the rapid growth and massive changes in China as she has, and about how all that started and the experiences she made along the way, we're very happy to speak with her today. Melinda Liu, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell me, growing up in Ohio, how did you get interested in coming to China?
Right. Well, China was a very alien concept because I was born in the States. But of course, my parents were Chinese, so they actually really wanted to see us. There were three of us born in the States, to see us learn Chinese and know something about Chinese culture. And they were mad Peking Opera fans, so they wanted to teach us that sort of thing. I think we were kind of resistant in the beginning, but by the time I got to college, I was sort of curious myself. What is this place of my ancestors? So I actually took a course, a first-year course of Chinese language, but didn't take it. Didn't pursue that so much in college. But at the end of my time, I got a postgraduate fellowship. I was at Harvard, and I got a postgraduate fellowship, which has a grand title. It was called the Michael C. Rockefeller Memorial Traveling Fellowship, and it was to fund travel to a different culture, where the recipient would experience something different, and you were allowed to, learn however you wanted to learn, but you shouldn't be enrolled in formal classes. So I wanted to come to mainland China, but in those days, this was 1973, it was very hard to get a kind of a tourist visa or something. So I ended up going to Taiwan, and I decided on my own, I thought it would be an interesting project, but I'm sure my parents were pleasantly surprised. I decided to study Chinese opera with another American student there, and I say study, but it was basically a lot of athletics, acrobatics and physical stuff, because we were much too old to learn to sing Chinese opera properly. Usually you begin at age 5, and we were already adults, so we focused on the physical aspect, which has many symbolic gestures, how to ride a horse when there isn't a real horse, and how to show this and how to show that, how do different roles play their roles. And she and I finally, in the end, we did perform on stage. And along the way, it turned out to be also a very good way to learn Chinese, because everyone performing Peking Opera are speaking very good, clear Peking dialect, Beijing dialect. So that sort of started it. Eventually, I was asked to be a freelance journalist for Newsweek, and I did that from Taiwan for a number of years. Then I got a full-time job at the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong, and then Newsweek came back to me and said, because I had wanted to work for Newsweek, and I said, I want to be overseas. And they said, well, we have something really good in Boston. I said, I've already been to Boston. That's where I went to college. I don't think I'll take that, but thank you very much. So then they came back to me and said, okay, now we're going to give you another job offer overseas. We've just been given permission by the Chinese government to open a bureau in Beijing. And I said, okay, that's a job I'll take. So I did.
What kind of questions would you get from the other performers, from other students? What did they know about where you were coming from?
Well, in those days, Peking Opera was a pretty alien concept for a lot of Westerners, and including myself, although I heard a lot of it by the time I got to Taiwan, because like I said, my parents were avid fans, amateur, Peking Opera fans, and sometimes they actually did a little performing themselves, just among their friends. The one thing you've got to remember is that forget about Western opera. It's not like that at all. Some of the concepts are very different, but it is a way to learn about Chinese history as a lived experience. When you could be a young person, but when you watch Peking Opera, suddenly you're transported back many centuries, and you're learning all these iconic battles and intrigue and love stories and things that have been in Chinese people's minds over the centuries. So for me, it was actually a great window into Chinese culture. So it's like a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. They have like standard ways of experiencing social interaction, and they're very different from the West. So I thought it was really valuable for that. But yeah, it's an alien concept. For most Westerners, the singing of Chinese opera sounds like cats wailing. And part of it is because it's actually a different concept of voice. Western opera singers spend a lot of time practicing a certain way of breathing and everything and opening up the throat and all this. And in Chinese opera, sometimes the concept is to kind of constrict the throat, so it's a very piercing sound. Reaches a big audience, but like I say, it sounds like a shriek more than a song. And partly that was, maybe fortunately for me, I was too old to actually be able to sing it the way it should have been sung. So I learned some of it, but, I was in groups where there were 5-year-old kids learning the same thing that I was learning. So I couldn't replicate the song because I was only doing it for a year. And I did manage to, for a period of time, get some of the movement down. There's a lot of movement involved in Chinese opera.
Were you introduced to them as an American, as a foreigner?
Yes.
What did they say?
Well, I had to have a proposal. And both my friend and I were born in the States, American citizens. And we basically just said, we're interested in Chinese opera and fascinated by the possibility of learning some of it. And in those days, there were quite a number of Peking opera schools in Taipei. Many of them were, affiliated with one thing or another, one branch of the military or one school or something like that. And one of the things that we really got into was how do you annotate the movement of Chinese opera? They have very precise movements. Your thumb has to be a certain way, your feet have to be a certain way. How do you convey that to someone who's never done it before? And then it turns out that just like a musical score, there's a visual method to annotate movement. It was called labanotation. And so we both learned a little bit of that in order to be able to, precisely chart what we were learning. What those 5-year-old kids were doing very naturally, but what for us wasn't that natural. Yeah.
When you arrived in China, how did that compare to the idea of China that you had before?
Right. Okay, my very first trip to mainland China was in 1978, and it was just a day trip. I remember it very vividly because it was an opportunity to visit what was then a fishing village called Shenzhen. Okay, so it's right across the border from Hong Kong. It's very close. Of course, in every other way, it was like centuries ago, very far removed. And literally, There were 17 fishing families in that place. And yet we saw a fair amount of construction. I was with a small group of people, including some diplomats and things. There was a fair amount of construction, and there were very big visions of what this was going to be. This was going to be a window to the world, a doorway both directions. This was going to be a highly advanced economic center. And what I saw was a pretty primitive fishing village. And I just was like, whoa, really? And yet, it all happened plus. I mean, today, Shenzhen is just an amazingly built up place, a completely new city, a city of the future. Okay, so I was not very impressed with what I saw in 1978, but I was intrigued. I was like, okay, this is a country very, very poor, trying to leapfrog into the League of Modern Nations. Let's see how that's going to go. Then the following year, I had an opportunity to spend longer in China and to go to more than one place. So I came as a journalist. I got a journalist visa. First, I came to Peking, which we called it then Beijing. Then I went down by train to Suzhou and met my brother and his family and 2 little children. And it was bizarre to meet someone who's a very close relative and with some physical similarity, but whom I'd never met before, like total strangers. But it was good. I mean, he was doing pretty well, better than some. And suddenly the fact that he had an overseas relative turned out to be a good thing for him, which had not been the case for all of the years that he lived there. But he lived in a very cramped, small little courtyard in Suzhou that's been completely demolished now. But because I was coming, and I think he was hoping I would stay with him, so they let him build another little room or something in the courtyard and gave them a little bit more space. And meanwhile, he had 2 little children, and the youngest was 5 years old, my niece. And she just thought this was the most amazing thing. So she was zooming around the courtyard in Chinese, yelling, "Auntie is a foreigner, Auntie is a foreigner," running around in circles. And my overwhelming impression of those few days in Suzhou is that everything was kind of somber and dark, because literally electric lights were not to be turned on, and left on all the time. People had them, but it was pretty dark. And that night, there were no street lights, and there weren't any taxis either. If you wanted to have a car to bring you around, you had to call and book it ahead of time, and it would come 20 minutes later, that sort of thing. So it was a kind of a somber gray. It was wintertime, actually. But underneath the surface, there was some excitement, because things were changing. Foreigners were coming. In those days, almost all foreigners who had friends in China would bring them watches, bicycles, sewing machines, televisions, cameras, this sort of thing. So I did bring a few of those things for my brother. And, for them it was like Christmas time, plus, because these are, for them at that time, luxury items that they had no dream of being able to have by themselves.
Maybe tell us, how did it come to be that you were living in Ohio and that your brother was living in Suzhou?
Right. Well, Suzhou was the hometown of my mother, and she had belonged to a family of scholars, and she was herself in college a student of American literature, especially, Western literature, and especially Shakespeare. And she did very well. She went to Tsinghua University. My father was also at Tsinghua, but he was in the science side. He was studying aeronautical engineering. But at some point, the entire university, indeed, the entire east coast of China was disrupted and chaotic because the Japanese occupation was coming. And so Tsinghua University, along with Beida and a few others, and the students and the teachers and the lab equipment and the libraries, they all tried to transport everything west, away from the Japanese. It went in stages. They didn't quite go far enough west at one point, so they kept going and going. Finally, they ended up in Kunming and reestablished a university there comprised of all these that had fled from Beijing, and it was called Xinan Lianda. And on this journey to the west of China, everyone was riding on trains, there were kind of big boxes of stuff being sent by trucks and all sorts of things. And my parents met on the train. Okay, so my father had known a woman, who was in a car with all these bunks and things, and my mother was on a neighboring bunk, and so they met. And then by the time they arrived in Kunming, a while later, he was courting her, and so she was staying, I guess, with a relative of hers. And eventually, my mother went back to Suzhou, where her family was, but they were pretty much, they were engaged. They were considering each other fiancé. But then my mother's father died. And immediately, her family sent a telegram to my father saying, okay, Manming, my mother's name, her father has died. If you are planning to get married and you want to do it quickly, you better come and do it now. Because in those days, the practice, the tradition was when there's a funeral or a death in the family, there's a period of mourning that goes on, not just for a month, not just for a year, but in their case, 7 years. So like no happy occasions for the family for 7 years. So my father said, no, I'm not going to wait that long. So he came back and they got married. They actually married in the YMCA in Shanghai, which was a kind of popular way for young Chinese to do it in those days. And that's how they got married. The whole situation was very disrupted by the war, obviously. Okay, within a year of being married, less than a year actually, my older brother was born. His name is Guangyuan. And then my father wanted to get back to what was then called Free China in the West, because he wanted to help the Chinese war effort. And there were like aircraft factories and Air Force operations taking place in the western areas, Chengdu, Yunnan, Kunming. There were Flying Tigers, a group of famous American, they were basically mercenaries, but they were working for the Chinese Air Force, flying planes and stuff like that. And there were aircraft being maintained and all kinds of logistics being done. So he wanted to meet them, get involved in that sort of activity. So he left Suzhou again to go west, and my mother stayed with her family with their child, their first child, and basically during these kind of disrupted war years, my mother's mother, I think, was the guardian for Guangyuan. Pretty much his whole life until the early 80s. After I met him in 79, my parents wanted him to come to America. So then he did go to America with his whole family, and they lived there for 20 years until he retired. And my nieces are still there, but he wanted to spend some time back in China where his friends were. So he spends part of his time in China now.
What was it like for him to move to America? Did he fit in easily, or was it difficult?
He adapted, and it helped that he was living with my parents in the beginning, in the same house. He didn't have any English, so that was a challenge, but but he wasn't well educated. He didn't go to college, wasn't given the opportunity to go to college. And so he found a job through friends of my parents. And he was, I think in the beginning, he was helping manage some apartments that a friend of my parents had owned. And then eventually he also worked in a factory. I think it was a tough adaptation, mainly because he didn't have friends in the States. And even though he had my parents, but some of these were friends of his. They were sent down to the countryside together. They spent some very formative years together, and I think he probably missed that a little bit. Of course, getting real Chinese food was a problem, a bit. Better now, but and he did fine. But like when he retired from his job in the States, then he was thinking about the friends. Now, back in China, some of these friends were tempted to do what we call jump into the sea, Shanghai, meaning become an entrepreneur. Some of them had been working for state-owned enterprises or in factories or whatnot, and some of them were like starting a whole new career as entrepreneurs and doing very well. So he came back, he reunited with a lot of these friends, and they, even today, even now, they're very good friends, and every once in a while they, as a group, they go back down to the countryside to visit the village where they had been sent down in the 60s. So it was, there was a lot of these childhood experiences that probably he missed being able to share that with the people, around him in the United States.
At this point, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our project. The period between China's opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping and the 2010 Shanghai Expo deserves to be remembered. We want to collect the memories that Chinese, Americans, and other foreigners made together during these times. We hope you will subscribe to our channel to see many more interviews like this one in the coming weeks. If you too have a story that you think needs to be remembered, we would very much like to hear from you. And we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate in Shanghai for their generous support. Without their sponsorship, we would not have been able to start this channel.
And then when you moved to Beijing, you opened up a Newsweek bureau. That was also a very special experience, to come from the West, where you could live anywhere you wanted to.
Right.
To come to Beijing, where you couldn't, and where people like your brother had grown up completely differently. They probably had a lot of interesting questions for you. What was that like?
Some, yeah. They did have some questions, and even the first question that people normally asked was a very emblematic of some of the East-West differences, because very often the first question is, how much money do you make? And of course in the States it's considered a little bit rude if you don't know someone, total stranger on the train, to talk about money. And then when you tell them, then it's incomprehensible because they don't know how much rent costs. I mean, you have to go into a whole primer of what is Western society all about before. But anyway, looking Chinese, but not having been raised in China, that was something new for a lot of the Chinese residents. And in the early days, well, we'll put it this way, it was easy for some Chinese to know that I wasn't a local because I was wearing my normal clothes, and especially the shoes. In those days they would look right at the shoes, because if you were wearing leather shoes, Western shoes, people know that you're not a local. Local people were wearing cloth shoes, often the black cloth shoes with white soles, or things with cheap little buckles. So much of the time, people thought figured out that I was an overseas Chinese or someone from Hong Kong. They might have thought, visiting. Once in a while, I would dress completely like a Chinese person, because in the spring of 1980, there were a number of big stories. One of the many big stories that were happening in China, but one of them was a large number of Chinese who had suffered during the Cultural Revolution, or who had some grievance during the Cultural Revolution, even maybe some a claim to some money or something like that. They wanted compensation. Maybe a house had been taken away from them and they wanted to be paid for it. And they started coming to Beijing. And it was very cold. It was wintertime. They were literally they were living in kind of ditches with a kind of a tent cover. And they had written long letters, longhand, about what their grievance was. And so this was a legitimate story, and I could speak to them because I could speak Chinese. But it wasn't a story that the government necessarily thought was a good story to get out. They weren't obsessively intent on keeping you away, but they just it was one of quite a number of topics that they didn't think was a good story from their side, from their point of view. So normally, if a white-skinned person would get kind of close to these kind of pretty feral communities, they would be told to go away or something like that. But wintertime, I dressed up in a big green padded coat, and I went down and talked with them, hunched in these little ditches. And, the stories were very moving. And then when I came back, I remember when I came back to my hotel after one of these episodes, the guards at the hotel didn't want to let me in because they didn't recognize that I had been living there, that I was an actual resident there. And then they finally recognized me. So that was an experience where probably I got that one story, partly because I looked Chinese and dressed like a Chinese. There were probably other stories that were much easier for a Caucasian to get. Foreigners were seen as very special people. Very often Chinese in those days wanted to treat them well. They didn't know quite how to, but they were very open. And so in that case, probably there were white foreign correspondents who had better access because they were white. But in the end, I think it was a wash. I think in some cases it was an advantage for me, and in some cases it was not an advantage for me. I think the big advantage is if you speak the language, you can get a lot more as a journalist. It's obvious.
Take me back to the first day of moving to Beijing. What was that like?
Oh gosh, I can't even remember the first day, but I do remember a moment of panic. Okay, first of all, I had described Beijing felt like a very dark place because it was physically dark. I arrived in March of 1980, so it was probably not quite like this. Like if you think back to a couple of weeks, it was actually really cold now, and we've got aircon turned on today, but it was cold. And people kept the windows closed, and I had no place to stay. Why? Because China wasn't quite geared up for tourism. There was no such thing as mass tourism in those days, and especially they weren't kind of geared up for all these pesky journalists from foreign countries who were trying to come in. And a lot of us were trying to come in at the same time because the American press corps was large and energetic, and were allowed to come in kind of all at the same time because normalization of Sino-US relations, diplomatic relations, had just happened. Until that happened, none of us were here. So that happened, and then there were several waves. First, the wire services were allowed to come, then the daily papers, then the weeklies, and then the TV people. So at any given time, depending on the wave, there were quite a number of people coming. And so there was no way to book yourself beforehand, really, unless you had a friend or something. So first I went to the Beijing hotel because that was the best hotel in town, and that's where a lot of business people were living long-term, and that's where some of the daily paper bureau chiefs were living, completely full. Not even a waiting list or anything, just go away, okay. So then I went to a lesser hotel in the south of town called the Chenman Hotel, where I knew there were a few other American foreign correspondents staying. And I went to the front desk, and it's fully booked, forget it, nothing. And I said, well, I don't have a place to stay. And they said, well, we don't have any room for you. And so then I said, okay, let me call a friend of mine. So I called a friend of mine who happened to be the bureau chief for the Baltimore Sun. And I said, so you're staying here in this hotel? He said, yes. I said, so you got a room where you're living, but you also have a room that you use as your office? He said, yeah. I said, can I just borrow that room for the night so I have a place to stay? He said, oh, sure. In fact, if as long as it can continue to use as an office, you can stay for a little while. So I said, okay, I think I have a plan of how I can get in here, but I do need a place to stay for at least a couple of days, I thought. So he very generously let me stay in this office, this empty room. It was just like a hotel room, beds and everything, but he was using it as an office. And then the next morning, I started walking up and down the hallways looking for evidence of someone checking out. Because very often in those days, they would put their luggage outside the door. And then I saw that a whole group, a visiting group, I don't even know who they were, tourists or business people or something, they were checking out and all their bags. So I chose a room that I knew was relatively big. It was like a suite, 855. I remember the number. And so then I ran down to the basement, to the ground floor, and I said, someone's checking out of room 855. Can I move into that room? And they said, how long are you going to be here? And I told them a week. In fact, I lived there for a year and a half. But that's how I found my little space. It was a roomy hotel room, but it was an older building, and it had a problem, which was there was a little bat living in my room. Yeah, once I was sitting there typing on a manual typewriter a story, and I noticed there was a curtain kind of moving a little bit. So I pulled it to one side to see what was moving on the other side, and a little bat started flying around. And I couldn't catch it. It was late at night. I had to file my story, so I just, filed the story. And that's a whole nother story about how long it took to do that. Then the next morning, I said, okay, I'll deal with it in the morning. Of course, the next morning I woke up, and there's no sign of the bat because they hide in the daytime. So then that night came out again and flew around. Finally, I called the room boy. In those days, we did call them room boys. They were not boys, but they were not very well trained either. They weren't exactly trained as service personnel. And anyway, so this room attendant came, and he helped me get a shoebox around this thing and take it away. Why didn't I deal with it when it was nighttime, when I was working on my story? Because the simple act of filing a story was a major deal. First, I had to type it out. Eventually, I got an electric typewriter. That was better, but some of us only had brought manuals. Then I had to get on my bicycle and ride down to something called the Telegraph Building, Denbao Dalou, which was several kilometers away. And then, I had to kind of go to a desk, and it was lugubrious, very dark. Go to a desk, give them a copy, and either they would do it or sometimes I would do it. Type into a telex machine. So you have to retype the whole thing again, and it spits out a little tape with holes in it and whatnot. And then when it's all done, that's what gets transmitted. It took hours. Even for the simplest thing, it took hours. And that's how we filed in those days. I mean, people today, they don't even know what a typewriter is, much less a telex machine. So it was difficult. It was difficult. I think had I not been quite so young and inexperienced and naive, I probably would have been a lot less patient with the whole process.
Of course, it took a lot, but certainly you also met so many interesting people in China. Maybe, can you take us back to a day or two like that?
In the run-up to the Summer Olympics in 2008, there was like an obsession with Chinese who could speak English and express this and that, volunteers who could help visitors find find their way around and all this other thing. And of course, their volunteer program for the Olympics was amazing and massive. In the middle of all this, I heard of a Chinese policeman who spoke fluent English. Not only that, he taught himself. So I thought that's kind of unusual. And his beat was a part of Beijing, like I think it was near north of the Forbidden City, around there somewhere where a lot of tourists normally were. So I applied to interview this guy, and he agreed. Okay, I was delighted, and I really wanted to ask him, like, how did he learn English by himself? Okay, because of course many Chinese speak excellent English, but they learn it through school and they learn it through their job or whatever. So he learned it on his own, and then he said, meet me at my apartment. That's kind of unusual, but I thought, fine. Okay, so I went to his apartment. It was tiny. It was like a really small room filled with, overflowing with two kinds of things. One was pirated DVDs of American films. And that's how he learned English. He would obsessively watch things like, like true crime, like LA Confidential, so he was like talking a little bit like a beat cop in Philadelphia or something. Okay, and then the other thing was all kinds of stuffed animals. Like you say, Disney type things, and teddy bears and panda bears and kitty things, and this was a grown man, a policeman, and it was overflowing with these stuffed animals, plush toys, I guess they call them. And I just thought this was like perfect. He's like a total, even though he's a policeman, he's like, pursuing some kind of private dream. And of course, many of those plush toys are Western originated, like the Disney toys, the whatever, even Hello Kitty, I think, is Japanese, right? Something like that. Anyway, so, I thought, okay, this guy's like living his dream. He loves true crime American films, and he likes stuffed animals, and he was just charming. And ever since then, I've tried to be less judgmental about the plush toy thing, because it's a cultural transmission method of sorts, and if people like something that they see that foreigners have, why not let them have it? So, and the weird thing is, several years later, many years later actually, probably 10 years later, I was on Coal Hill at that little pavilion on the top of Coal Hill looking over the Forbidden City. I was part of a group tour where the tour group leader wanted to do a little photo exhibition by bringing big black and white photos framed of what it looked like before liberation, so you could kind of compare. And then we all thought this was great, and he brought some champagne, and so we were all drinking and looking at these things. And suddenly two policemen appeared. And you're not supposed to have a public photo exhibit on top of an imperial building. So so we went over to talk with them, and they would say, you're having a photo exhibition here, and I basically said, well, no, not really. We just did a tour, and we wanted to show the before and after. And then I noticed it was this guy. It was the same guy, still doing the same beat. Because there are a lot of foreigners there. And so I said, hey, I know you. I interviewed you in 2008. He said, oh, yeah, I remember. And then we were like best friends. And then, of course, there was no problem. It was like just this harmless thing. And, anyway, like one of the photographs was rather large and framed. And we just like took that down and, and it was fine. But it was just so funny that this chance encounter would leave such a deep impression on me, and then I would have a chance to meet that guy again. Only in Beijing.
Most people had never seen a foreigner. They had never talked to a foreigner. What were these first interactions like? Did you guys have different takeaways?
Sometimes when I traveled, people weren't quite sure. And that was an interesting thing because sometimes they were like, oh, she looks kind of different, but she's probably just from Shanghai. You know, that sort of thing. You know, the regional differences within China were also very, very deep. And so, like, you know, if you're out in some rural part of Yunnan on the border with Burma, they might be thinking, oh, you know, this is what people in Shanghai look like. They had no idea. So they weren't always reacting to me as a foreigner per se. But there were like, you know, I've had some and I've seen some kind of humorous experiences because, like, sometimes I traveled with Newsweek colleagues who were very clearly foreigners. And so one time I remember one of my colleagues named Tracy Dalby, who was very tall, came, and we were traveling in Jiangsu province, somewhere near Shanghai, but not in Shanghai. And we were doing a kind of a preview of a trip by a major American political leader. I don't know if it was a president or secretary of state or something like that. Anyway, huge crowds were starting to follow us around. Why? Because they thought he was actually the guy. They thought he was the guy. And I'm like, no, he's just the journalist. They just had no idea. And, you know, very often people would stare. Very often people would follow you around, just curious, you know. And then always they would ask questions very often about money. How much do you make? How much does it cost to rent a house? You know, how much does it cost to buy a car? And then you have to go into this long explanation of, like, rents are really high in the U.S. because, you know, in those days, some people didn't pay rent, or they paid like 1 or 2 kwai worth of rent every month. So in the early days, there was a lot of funny misunderstandings. More, you know, then as time went on, it became less and less a deal for me because I wasn't into dressing in a very dramatic or necessarily fashionable way. I mean, you know, in my work, I want to be comfortable above all. So at some point, I don't even remember when it was, but it was probably in the 90s sometime, I would end up being more plainly dressed than some of the Chinese. You know, like they were wearing, like, you know, leopard fur coats and things like that. They thought that was cool. And I'm not into that. Or bright red, you know, that was a bright red this and bright red that. And, you know, sometimes I wear red, but, you know, it's not a big deal. And I was perfectly fine to wear black clothes, which, you know, in China is like, you know, only old people wear black clothes, that sort of thing. If you had, like, flowery, frilly, this and that, whatever, people thought, oh, you know, this is what a fashionably dressed person is like. So I was just, I wasn't taken as a foreigner. I was just taken as a Chinese who doesn't dress very fashionably. You know, it's different. It's different now.